Hey everybody, I am the Space Ace, Ubaldo Siminietti, one of your co-hosts of Liftoff. Thank you for joining us. So today we're doing a live viewing of our pre-recorded show for this month in honor of Valentine's Day. We're talking all about sex and space. Thank you for joining us, and please stick around after because all of the hosts and some of the guests will be back live today to answer your questions and talk a little bit about feedback from the show. So again, thank you all for being here, and we will be back with you live in just a little bit. Hey everybody, welcome back to Liftoff. I am one of your hosts, Ubaldo Siminietti. It is a pleasure to see you again for this February episode honoring Valentine's Day, love, and other topics related to that. Particularly, one thing that we wanted to talk about today is sex and space. It's a conversation that is happening, but not at the scale that we believe it should be happening, because that's a key aspect of human beings moving into space, onto the moon, to Mars and beyond, right? If we're going to propagate our species and make space travel possible, and make living in space possible, that's a big thing. So let's say hi to everybody real quick, the four hosts, and then we're going to dive into a conversation with our first guest. But first, Meredith, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Ubaldo and everyone. I'm good. I hope everyone's having a great start to the day. My name is Meredith Garfalo. I am an award-winning broadcast meteorologist and space and science correspondent. Also gained the nickname Rocket Girl, covering a lot of rocket launches and satellite launches across the country. I am so excited to be part of this because being part of the broadcast media for 16 years now, I have seen so many topics come to the forefront, and space is slowly getting to be one of them. And so in 2017, I started to dedicate my career to doing space reporting. As a scientist, I can understand a lot of these things and a lot of these topics and be able to communicate with engineers and data analysis and talking to them, and stuff that may come across as hard to understand for the general public. But through my background in writing and storytelling, I'm able to help communicate this to the general public of all ages and get these space topics in the forefront. And my mission is to continue to get these topics out there, do events like this, be part of things like this, to get more and more media to say, hey, this is as big of a topic as climate change was, because 10 years ago, climate change was more of a, is it happening, is it not happening? Now it's forefront of news coverage. News teams have segments all over the country. And so my goal is to help bring to the forefront and into the light why space is important and why it needs to be a big covered topic. So thanks for having me. Next, I'll pass it over to Daniel Tompkins. Hello, Daniel.
Good morning. Well, I'm an agricultural scientist and accidental space technology founder, and excited to be talking about biology today. So I'll do a short intro, and looking forward to the conversation. And pass it off to Anara.
Good morning, Spacers. It's Anara Tabir, the Galaxis Gal. Happy to be here with another great episode of Liftoff with my amazing co-hosts, and we've got some exciting guests today. I think this topic is going to be a hot one, literally. We need to talk about, sex and reproduction in space. It not only is it part of who we are as a human species to our core, but also it's really not possible to have long-term settlement in space without being able to produce more humans. So I'm excited to cover this topic, and I think it's one we need to normalize for sure.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, with that, let's dive in. First of all, I just want to pump the swag here. I've got my Liftoff mug for the conversation and my t-shirt.
Why, Ubaldo, wherever did you get that lovely merchandise?
Yes. If you go to our website, what's somebody remind me?
F4Fspace.org, and that's F number 4 Fspace.org. Check it out. We've got some amazing merch. Get yourself a hoodie. I highly recommend the hoodies. Yes. They're very nice.
They're great. They're great. So yes, let's wrap the show. But now let's get to our first guest. We're really excited. So David Cullen is professor of astrobiology and space biotechnology at Cranfield University in the UK. David, I'm going to let you talk more about the breadth of your experience and your career so far and what you're doing now, because I will butcher it. So first of all, David, welcome to Liftoff. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you. Oh, does all your guests get a free hoodie? I can't remember whether that was part of the deal.
April, I think we should make a note of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
We'll confirm
for
with our
sure.
producers.
That depends. Will you wear it at every single major event you go to? That's the question.
Ooh, I like that.
We can negotiate that offline.
I like it.
I like him. He's already negotiating with the team.
That's
Yes.
right. That's right.
But I've already forgot what the question was. So
Well, just tell us a little about you, your background, really fascinating background, and how you got to, the core of what you're doing today. And then, we want to talk a little bit about that.
yeah, so obviously growing up as a child, I was kind of broadly interested in space, but career-wise had no aspirations of doing anything in space. So did a first degree in biochemistry, then PhD and postdocs in marrying together biochemistry and engineering, creating what we were calling biosensors or bioanalytical techniques for application in medical and environmental applications here on Earth. So PhD, postdocs, then I got my kind of independent kind of academic position at Cranfield, actually many years ago now, and was quite happily kind of developing, again, these kind of sensors, these analytical techniques for medical and for environmental applications, because that's how I accidentally stumbled into the space sector. Because we were developing, as part of European kind of projects or collaborative projects, kind of remote analyzer boxes that could be put into the environment, and to measure in situ trace organic pollutants in things like water and soil, as part of monitoring programs and as potentially part of kind of process control things. So trying to develop these kind of in situ sensors for trace pollutants in samples such as water and soil. So nothing to do with space. And then it was just one of those kind of random events where I just happened to decide 50-50, do I go to a kind of lunchtime seminar or not at our university? I decided to go, happened to start chatting to the kind of lecturer afterwards. And he was somebody from the space kind of sector who was looking at developing missions to detect life on Mars. We got talking and realized that what we were doing in terms of detecting trace levels of organic compounds in complex samples like soil is exactly what you need to do on Mars to try and detect trace levels of organic molecules, which are indicators of potential or the kind of preserved evidence of ancient, possibly now extinct Martian life. So to go to Mars to scoop up some soil or regolith, to extract the organic molecules that's there and analyze them for trace levels of certain molecules, which are strong indicators of there being life on Mars. So that's what got me into. So it was one of those kind of literally, I got in my calendar or diary the hour and the day which it happened, and then that obviously kind of changed my career. So then that got us involved, and I was the kind of joint lead of one of the European instruments that was on the original European Space Agency ExoMars rover. So we had a number of years developing that instrument. That instrument eventually got deselected from the mission, as many instruments do. So then I carried on looking at other aspects of biotechnology, bioscience, hardware to do bioscience experiments in space. This will come to actually the main topic in a minute. And so therefore, currently we've got a number of projects looking at various aspects of thinking about how Earth biology can support humans going into space, how we can use space to kind of do basic bioscience kind of experiments in space. And one of those projects was to think about developing mission concepts and hardware to demonstrate in vitro fertilization in space. And the reason was that I got involved with a company or organization, which I believe you've got a guest coming on later from the same organization called Spaceborne United, that is an advocacy group to try and promote the idea that we need to start thinking now about the issues of how humanity can become an off-world species. So following on the kind of same kind of arguments that Elon Musk and others use about us becoming a multiplanetary off-world species. But focusing on the fact that the whole human life cycle, including reproduction and such, that could easily be one of the major showstoppers, in that we don't know enough about how all of the life cycle stages of human development, from the development of kind of the gametes, the embryos, the eggs, the kind of sperm cells, through to fertilization, embryo development, then live birth, and of course development of children through to adolescence, to kind of being adult, and then of course the later stages, kind of old age and such. How all of those are going to be affected by space environments, changed levels of gravity and such, and that could easily be the showstopper, not the technology. So therefore, we got involved in thinking about how can we help with developing some of this literally detailed space hardware that could translate the kind of current IVF workflow into space, obviously using potentially kind of mammalian species, not humans in the first instance, or human cells in the first instance. Therefore, as part of that conversation with Spaceborne, we had the conversation about, when do we think would be the first human conception in space? And we thought about it being, well, it's going to be decades before we have enough knowledge about the risks and such that Earth society, as represented by various ethics committees and such, would approve the in vitro, or the kind of fertilization in space, and allow that to go in some way to kind of a live birth. Decades away, it's obvious. And I think I made the throwaway comment, but surely as soon as you get space tourists going into space, think of the equivalent, the Mile High Club kind of in aviation, there's going to be space tourists who engage in sexual interactions, and therefore some of those could result in the first human conceptions in space, but literally only in the next 10 years or so, not decades away. And so it was a throwaway comment, almost a joke. And then we looked around the table when we was discussing it, thinking, well, surely the space tourism communities thought about this as a potential risk, potential activity. And the more we looked into it through public domain sources, and also some kind of behind the scenes kind of contact we've got in the sector, it seems like nobody is thinking about this seriously, is what would be the consequences of human sexual interactions among this kind of cohort of people going into space that could result in a significantly increased probability of human conception. What would be the consequences if that did occur? And therefore that's, sorry, it's slightly rambling, but we've eventually got there. So that is the basis for then some work we did to then explore that whole kind of question and what the current status is and what some of the issues could be, and publish that in a green paper just under a year ago. And obviously that's raised quite a bit of interest generally, and I believe that's the reason why kind of you've come across that, and obviously therefore invited me on today. So that's the kind of slightly long kind of background to get to the point where I think you're hoping the conversation will go.
Wow. Can I just say wow, because I never thought about it that way, and I'm sure a lot of people watching feel the same way, and they're hearing this, and it's a lot. But when you present it like that, you're right. This is a big topic, and this is something that we need to address as a community, but also as a globe, and everyone is thinking about space travel so soon.
Yeah, and so therefore go straight to kind of the key message we've got is that what are the consequences? So in this kind of green paper, I'm sure you'll post in some of the kind of your media, kind of the link to the paper and such, for people to want to read it. What we've ended up doing is saying, look, here is the argument that leads to the kind of the conclusion that there is going to be a significant increase in the potential for human conception in space via the space tourism kind of activity in the next 10 or so years, and that probability completely changes compared to the 500 or so humans that's already been in space, who are professional astronauts, and we argue why there is a very low probability that sexual interactions have occurred, and certainly there's no reliable documented evidence to say sexual interactions have occurred, and certainly no human conception in space has occurred among that cohort. But we argue that it is likely to change. The probability massively increases as soon as you start thinking about who is flying, why they're flying, and how different they are, and the environment is going to be different from professional astronauts. So therefore, the increased probability. But then what's the consequences? one of the consequences would be simply a risk to the space tourism sector, in that if conception did occur, and there were therefore then problems associated with that conception and the kind of subsequent embryo development and such, you can see that there's all kinds of chances for kind of litigation, for kind of risk associated with simply almost the business model of kind of the space tourism sector, because obviously there's the direct litigation, but there's also reputational damage and such, depending how it's handled. So there's we think a significant or a defined risk to the space tourism sector because of that almost legal litigation, reputational damage that could occur. Then, of course, there's also the whole ethical aspect of that happening, and literally the biological consequences that could result in kind of in a non kind of normal kind of development of an embryo and kind of fetus and kind of potentially kind of live birth and then future developments. All of that is a massive unknown, and therefore there's ethical risk associated with that, as well as obviously biological risks. And so that's kind of the essence of kind of the story. Obviously, we can now look at that in a bit more detail, but that's where we see the key risks being the risk to that kind of, if you want, the financial, the kind of reputational image of the kind of space tourism sector, and of course the broader kind of societal, ethical, biological kind of consequences.
So to unpack some of that, I mean, wow, what a span there of activities, from detecting life, from instruments to detect life there, to cellular development of life in situ, to critical failure points of sustained biology in space. That also very accidental coming into the space sector. And I see biosensors in agriculture really taking off, but less on the mechanical side, more on the biological side. So I did have a question on detecting life and maintaining these systems, how useful you think biological indicators will be at both monitoring environments, making sure environments are conducive to life broadly, because we can't have sensors for everything, right? And we don't know, there's a lot of unknowns about what will develop. So I did have a question on your thoughts on that, both for the future on Earth and in space.
Yeah, obviously that's almost a completely different discussion. But so I'll briefly kind of comment on that before obviously getting back onto what I assume is the main topic. I mean, the example I've got is specifically from our work. So obviously now going back kind of over 10 years when we was working on this before it got deselected. Obviously we had an instrument to detect evidence of life. But the question then is, when you start burying into that, the kind of details you're suggesting is, right, well, what kind of life are we looking for? Because you can't have a sensor, or it's difficult to envisage a sensor that simply detects life. You're detecting an indicator of life or some aspect of life. And so we ended up having to have a very specific science case such that we could argue we are looking for this type of life, and therefore could design a sensor that would have a reasonable chance of detecting that type of life. And so therefore our science case for that instrument was to detect Earth-like life in the Martian environment, the argument being that the early Mars, about kind of 4 billion years ago, was warm and wet and with a similar kind of molecular inventory as to what we knew was present on Earth. We know on Earth life rapidly kind of emerged. And therefore, the science case we had was, we hypothesized that similar life could emerge on Mars. It's just that Mars then dried out, or rather lost its atmosphere, became the cold, dry, icy place, such that life died out, or at least is not present on the surface anymore. But also that Mars doesn't have plate tectonics, and therefore a lot of the geology we can easily access on the Martian surface or near subsurface is geology from 4 billion years ago. And therefore, there's a reasonable chance that if there was any Earth-like life present then, there should still be molecular indicators of that preserved in the geology that was laid down at the same time and is still readily accessible here on Earth. Sorry, kind of on the comet Mars. So obviously, that's one nuanced way that, yes, you have to bury down and turn it into something which is scientifically relevant, but also technologically doable.
And this is in regards to the life marker chip, the LMC,
and that was
slated
an slated
for 2028 for liftoff. So if we're wearing the liftoff shirt, 2028, I believe it's still scheduled for?
Well, hold on. So we got involved in the ExoMars mission. I think the first time we started preparing a proposal was 2003, when we proposed an instrument. When we proposed the instrument, I think the original launch date was 2008, so 2008. Clearly, it's slipped a bit since then. And that's been enough time for the mission to evolve with different partners. And one of the key stages of that mission was about 2012, when there was a big change in partnerships. NASA was a partner at one point, they dropped out. The mission almost got cancelled. ESA then partnered with Russia, and it meant that a much smaller rover had to be flown. And therefore, the original large payload then had to be cut down to fit into then the kind of current rover. So our payload isn't on that, but that rover mission is still, as you say, it's still to fly. It almost flew just prior to kind of obviously the geopolitics involved in kind of Russia kind of invading Ukraine, and that basically stopped the kind of the launch in the last window. Then people are now looking to how to kind of get the rover onto the Martian surface without obviously Russian kind of involvement going forwards. But coming back to the kind of sex in space kind of topic, and the and thinking about this kind of issue to do with kind of space tourism, I think the what I've missed out in terms of the top level story we've got is also what is our recommendations. Because what we're not trying to do is simply say, look, here is a problem, but give no solution. Because what we don't want to do is two things. We don't want to do anything that actually in a kind of potentially kind of jeopardizes the space tourism kind of sector. Because for all kinds of reasons, I think it is a reasonable thing to want to happen. So what we don't want to do is to simply give no recommendations. One of the key things we don't want to do is to say there should be no sexual interactions in space among space tourists. Because if you look, and we do this in our green paper we published, if you look at some of the business models, although they don't explicitly talk about sexual interactions, they certainly implicitly imply in that there's talk about space honeymoons, first dates in space. So behind the scenes, there certainly is business models which kind of allude to sexual interactions. So what we don't want to do is ban them. What we want to do is to say there needs to be approaches to minimize the potential that sexual interactions result in human conception.
I was going to say, David. Oh, sorry. I'm just going on this topic. And you can finish, and then I think the big thing is you have one bad press, like we see. The media is going to run with it. And we know they're going to take whatever they need to do and put it out there. So I guess my question is, being in the media, is there some disclaimer that you're suggesting if you go into space? What are your thoughts on that, David?
Yes. So what we've got is a number of clear recommendations. One of the recommendations we do not say, because it's basically it's a dead end in terms of the short-term space tourism sector, is to say there needs to be more kind of research on the risk of human conception, because that's going to take decades before there's enough kind of evidence to allow human conception to occur, for example, in microgravity. So we're not suggesting that. What we are suggesting is that from an operational point of view, to minimize the potential, then I think, as you were alluding to, it is an obvious choice, that there is a compulsory need for all space tourists as part of what's almost certainly going to be their compulsory kind of medical induction, or I've got the correct words, their kind of pre-flight medical consultations to explain the risks and kind of obviously kind of to sign waivers, to do the same with an aspect of sexual interactions. So to make it clear to all kind of space tourist participants, what are the kind of risks and such, to make people fully informed and aware of that, and then to effectively sign a waiver to say that if then, given all of that informed kind of that informed position, they still engage in sexual activity and conception occurs, then then obviously the liability is on them, not the space kind of tourism operators. Now, clearly, that's a suggestion, and therefore the immediate follow-up is to then start exploring the details of what what the legal nature of those waivers would be, and that there were the legal framework is robust enough, and what the kind of medical consultation would be, and such. But very practical, short-term things that could be done. The other aspect we recommended was that obviously on Earth, the way you minimize the probability of human conception is to use contraceptive approaches or techniques. But once again, if you think about from a systems engineering point of view, and a legal framework, those contraceptive techniques have been validated and approved for use in 1G environments, non-space environments. And therefore, there isn't any kind of validation of these contraceptive techniques for use in space in microgravity. And so therefore, one of the other recommendations is to explore what would be needed to get current off-the-shelf human contraceptive techniques to be validated for use in space. Now, what that workflow would look like, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in that area, but that's one of the recommendations, because that feels like, again, something that is that is kind of doable in the relatively short term, and would then allow what we were definitely not trying to kind of stop, which is sexual interactions, because as I said, that's part of some of the alluded to in business models, to allow sexual interaction, but to minimize the probability of human conception.
Well, I think what we're talking about here is the ethics involved. And so I would love to know more about how you're dealing with the ethics or the ethics walls or boundaries or barriers that are probably, I'm guessing, being put up for you, and the ability to research this. I mean, what's the process like for you to figure out, if sex in space is going to work safely, if contraception is going to work safely? Talk about your route to getting to that information, but also some of the barriers that may have been put up for you.
So, okay, I think the important thing is that remember that what we've done in terms of putting this argument out there really came off a kind of almost a jokey conversation. So this wasn't originally our intention to obviously do this work. So we are not necessarily trying to actively ourselves, in terms of kind of myself and the team that put out the screen paper, we are not necessarily trying to now actively follow this.
I'm thinking more about like Spaceborne United, for instance, and their work with reproduction in space. Well, how do we get to the point where we can start testing this ethically without a lot of backlash?
Okay, so again, that's separating things out, I think. So therefore, in terms of the immediate short-term issue of highlighted in terms of kind of what we call uncontrolled human conception in space in emerging space tourism is more or less the name of the paper. For that, we are just trying to put these arguments out into the community and suggest some routes forward for the community to then hopefully pick that up and take it forward, not for us to take it forward. We're here to nudge and encourage and help where necessary, but we're not looking to drive it forward. We think the community, if they agree with the argument, should be driving this forward. Now,
absolutely. You're kind of dealing with a force of nature, and you're trying to set up some sort of understanding of the dangers involved and maybe some basic guidelines, because once people start getting up on a worldview balloon 6 hours on orbit, there's not a lot you can do to control what happens.
Okay, so clearly it depends what you mean by control what happens. Definitely you can control what happens to some extent.
Some degree.
Influence. Yeah, you can influence, because obviously that's what we're suggesting in terms of having kind of almost not informed consent, but kind of obviously kind of medical waivers, making sure people are aware. So again, all of that is to influence behaviour. We also talk in the paper about literally just the ergonomics of spacecraft in terms of whether there is the kind of chance, depending upon your cultural background, for intimacy or not, privacy. Therefore, in some spacecraft where there's just large open cabins, that will, for certain cultures and certain people, kind of reduce the probability. But if you have in some spacecraft or space hotels that's being proposed the idea of private cabins, then clearly that's influencing in another direction. So those are also things we explore.
Well, you have to also consider, I mean, we're human, right? Sorry, David. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So therefore, coming back to, I think, what was the bigger, longer term picture, which is not what we was addressing in there. This is more the kind of the remit, I think, of one of your guests later on, later today, Egbert from Spaceborne, who actually leads Spaceborne. His kind of remit is definitely more focused towards the long term and thinking about kind of what is kind of the future for kind of humanity if we are going to become a multiplanetary off-world species, kind of when is that kind of full human life cycle going to start occurring off Earth? What are at the moment some of the showstoppers? And as you highlighted, if we actually want to take humans and have humans at the moment, given our level of understanding, reproduce in a different gravity environment, in a significantly different ionizing radiation environment, then there is all kinds of ethical reasons why it would be inappropriate to allow that to happen until we have enormous amounts of kind of data to show that it is safe to an acceptable standard where the negatives or where the benefits outweigh the negatives.
Well, and we also, I think, have to consider, I mean, again, we're human. And so as we, establish, operations on the moon and Mars and beyond, there's the aspect of alcohol, drugs, right? Like the things that are going to enhance, in the spirit of, the Valentine's Day, right? They're going to enhance the mood, if you will. And so, I don't know if there's a lot of consideration going on around all of that, right? Like the influences, the environment. No matter where we go, we're always bringing our humanity with us. So it's there's this comprehensive look or research that needs to be done. I don't know if that's being talked about as much.
I think there's two things. Don't let me forget to answer the question you just asked. But the first one is just to finish off this bit about kind of when could we get human reproduction of kind of off Earth. I think unless there's a really rapid kind of increase in our understanding about the influences of space on human reproduction, then it is to try and make space look like the surface of the Earth. So even in the work which I got involved in initially, which is to think about really short-term, kind of relatively near future, kind of low Earth orbit missions to demonstrate IVF workflow in space. To get regulatory approval for that, for if we were to use humans, then again, I think if we was to do it in microgravity, it would be decades away. So therefore, our approach is to say, right, if we want to do something in the shorter term, in terms of some general preparation, and we want to get that approved by society on Earth as represented by various kind of ethics panels and such, we have to make what happens in microgravity in low Earth orbits look like 1G. And therefore, what we've proposed as the demonstration system is to have the whole IVF workflow happening in a mini centrifuge. So therefore, the key thing is that although we can then show some of the stages of human reproduction in space, it's not going to be in microgravity. The actual steps will occur in an environment which is 1G. And also we try and make sure there's enough radiation shielding such that those steps occur in what appears to be an Earth normal environment. So therefore it takes away the kind of the arguments that what we don't know what will happen. So I think that is going to be the kind of, that's going to be likely the way to get human reproduction or steps of human reproduction occurring in space, especially if you're going to obviously do it with societal approval. It's actually to avoid the negative aspects of space and therefore have those stages done in centrifuges replicating 1G with enough radiation shielding that effectively you've got the same radiation environment as we have here on the surface of the Earth. So that's the bit I want to add in. I think then the question you asked me was about the more kind of societal aspects of kind of a more diverse range, larger numbers of humans going in onto Moon and Mars. We talk about kind of a persistent human presence now on the Moon going forwards. Yeah. And I think that there is now slowly starting to be some kind of recognition, and you can even see it in some of NASA's kind of top level documentation, where they are now using the term, and we've used it before. You try and allow astronauts to survive in space. Basically, they don't die. You allow them, secondly, to then function. Can they do stuff? Can they operate as part of the system? And now they're using the kind of, can they survive, function, and thrive. And that's the idea of, well, if people are now not going to go there as these kind of really specialized kind of astronauts, they're going to be there more as just workers, then you need to think about allowing people to have to thrive and not just go there, do a job and nothing else, and have all their time micromanaged as astronauts do at the moment. You've got to think about recreation and such. And actually, we've got another project to do with what we call astronaut playscapes, which came from a completely different direction. But it's actually addressing that issue. It is to think about, or we identified the fact that in the next generation of kind of space systems, human-rated space systems, including long-duration ones, which are going to go to the moon or to Mars, there still doesn't seem to be a requirement to capture, at least thinking about, the need for astronaut recreation as part of those systems. And so part of that, we then kind of try to highlight that with some ongoing work to do with what we call astronaut playscapes, really with a worked example, to try and emphasize the fact that future space systems need to consider as a requirement within their kind of requirements, a need for astronaut recreation features, at least to be considered, even if it's then explicitly kind of left out, fine, but at least it's considered. Whereas as far as we can see, the kind of next generation of space systems, it's not even considered. They're just carrying on the same workflow that you've had for the ISS, which again doesn't really have any engineered kind of features deliberately designed in to deal with astronaut recreation. Everything that happens on the ISS is really just emergent activities from the astronauts themselves. It's never been properly designed into the system.
When you say playscapes, the first thing I think is Lister talking about zero-G football. Or maybe we're going to have some zero-G poker games in space.
Yes.
Now, the reality is microgravity table football.
Okay.
Nice.
So
I love it.
actually,
That's now the official sport of the show.
Yeah.
And actually, that is actually what's in the paper we're in the process of getting published, to use as a worked example of what a playscape or a playscape could look like. We're not saying it should be table football, but is that obviously something like table football, obviously re-engineered to work in microgravity and such, which is quite easy to do. But to then think about how that would be used. So clearly, it would be there to promote kind of astronaut interaction, kind of recreation, and all of the other kind of team kind of working and kind of psychological aspects that having those kind of things in a kind of quite a stressful system has. So there's all kinds of arguments about that. But also there's more physical ones, which is we're proposing that those games should be instrumented so that one, they could be used if necessary as research tools, but also instrumented so they can monitor astronaut kind of performance, so things like hand-eye coordination and these kind of things, so that they could be used to, obviously with consent from the astronauts, to then identify if somebody was starting to exhibit behavior or kind of changes that might impact the health of the overall human-in-the-loop space system. And so we can see it in multiple ways. It's not just giving some recreation, but it's properly integrating, thinking about how that function can have multiple uses and how a much more detailed understanding of how it would contribute to the overall kind of human in the loop kind of space system and contribute in a positive way what it would address. And it's more than just the simple view of astronaut recreation. But again,
that's great, David. We are so happy to have you be part of this segment, and we'll see you back later in the program. But if people, before you leave and we transition to our next part of our show, if people want to reach out to you, if they want to find you, maybe get more information, what's the best way to do it? Is it LinkedIn? Do you want to have us put your email in the chat? What do you think?
I think that either LinkedIn or email would work. So I think I'm happy to, because again, obviously people got my name and my affiliation. A quick web search will give my contact details anyway. So so LinkedIn and email would be fine.
And we will post the green paper whenever we mark it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. In that case, I will see you later today.
We are so happy to have you, and we can't wait to talk more later, because I don't know about you guys, but my mind is just blown. It's like watching a documentary on something I never would have thought about, but now it's cool. Next time you watch a movie and you see people having fun in space, you're going to be like, Wait a second. This is something that needs to be more discussion.
When you get back, we're gonna have to talk about that famous scene in The Expanse. I want to get your professional opinion on if
Oh,
that was choreographed properly. Thank you so much for joining us today, David.
yeah. Thanks,
Bye.
David. Yeah, we could talk about Moonraker, James Bond. I think
So I assume I can leave now because I've got to go to another meeting.
Yeah.
Oh,
not
yes,
a
you
problem.
can go.
Yes,
Yes,
we'll see you
yes.
later,
Thanks,
David. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Yeah, talking about sex in entertainment, I think that's a fascinating discussion, right? Particularly as it relates to sci-fi, because I think the first time I remember seeing that was in James Bond, Moonraker. I think it was Moonraker, where he was, floating and but they were horizontal, like with the blanket over them. But is that possible? Probably not. Who
There
knows?
are
Maybe.
probably a lot of people out there who are saving up their retirement accounts to figure that one out.
Yeah, exactly.
So
This is
Daniel, it's
not-
funny because when he was talking about, I don't know the exact thing he said, but he was talking about soil, and he's like, well, not really space. And I saw you go, maybe we should embed a little bit more about that, hidden space program,
Yeah,
especially when it comes. I think his journey seemed to me to be almost like your journey in getting into space.
yeah. So it's interesting, right? Monitoring that environment. Biosensors are going to be a big part, I think, of making sure that environment is conducive to life. Is that we're not going to be able to bring sensors for everything, and biology can help both be an early detector, particularly in agricultural systems. It's why make that sensor for detecting something when you can very easily edit a plant to be hypersensitive to those conditions. So really the future of agriculture, this is still 20, 30 years out, but the seeds are there and the economics are there to incorporate living biosensors essentially into our agricultural production systems. It's interesting seeing the pushback on, can we physiologically develop in space? And one of the biggest aspects hormonally, that can be influenced both by human activity and their physiology, but particularly in plants, a lot of those are gravitationally regulated. So people said, oh, you couldn't grow a plant in space. There was this pushback around growing plants in space is that, oh, no, 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 these things are gravitationally dependent, that they would all malfunction. And sure enough, of course, we do have higher plants growing in space successfully. So an interesting way around some of those barriers is what's called random positioning machines, where they actually randomly, basically, so the net gravity force is zero. So this is a very simple element that many folks in space biology utilize to kind of replicate kind of a net zero G element. And it'd be interesting to see if that's something that is incorporated in this workflow. Is do you have in vitro? Do you have someone? You always hear these stories of a pregnant woman gets in a car accident. She's in a hospital bed for 6 months. Very reduced physical activity. Positioning is probably very abnormal. You're not in the same position. So I'm always kind of thinking of, well, okay, but what's the most Earth-based example of some of this stuff? Because often there is that kind of hidden space element, I think, for some of these challenges that are overlooked as just existing data points that we could go after.
Well, I think there's also this issue where, we're going to run into this wall where they can't go any further. People will do experiments where they try to mimic zero G on Earth. And no matter what they do, no matter how great it is, it's still not going to be zero G. It's still not going to be that exact environment in space. And so we're going to get to a point where we've done all the work we can do on the planet. Now it's going to have to actually happen in space. And I'm curious, my biggest kind of focus on this is going to be the ethics kind of boundaries, the ethics walls that are put up. And that's what I see on a regular basis. Any sort of cutting edge technology, especially when it involves, possible loss of life or worse, there are all these walls that are thrown up and it slows down that research. So for this one, I wonder, exactly how we're going to make it over that curve.
Well, and I think, another aspect of the ethics conversation is how we're testing this. I think, there's a backlash against the, animal testing that's occurring. Could there be, and there is, I think there's a lot of talk around using technology and, the avatars or digital twins to sort of create the environment, Daniel, that you're talking about, and then mimic that, right, in a online environment or kind of metaverse environment. Can we, how close are we, do you think, to stuff like that?
On the
You know,
organic chemistry level, that's a huge challenge, but there is a workflow towards that. As far as artificial reproductive, well, enhanced, well, I guess extended gestation that's artificially supported. There's also in animal agriculture, there's big advancements in that where they've been able to take a sheep and essentially make an artificial womb and really shorten the gestation period, in a very artificial environment. So I think in animal agriculture, there are definitely some possibilities of doing very in vitro studies.
well, and I wonder too, like you talk about with certain unregulated drugs by the FDA, is it going to be something where all of a sudden it's like, okay, we're going to be doing this experiment and it's going to be trying with contraception in space? Are people going to want to sign up for that and risk it? Because I feel like that would be a way around it. If people are like trying a clinical drug, going in knowing something could go wrong, is that the process we're going to have to take to get people to go up there and to, figure out some of these questions we have?
And
mean,
it's
it might
interesting
be.
coming from the world of plants. We do all this stuff to plants that like we would never do in animal science, right? So some things that we do in plants, it's like, oh, there's no risk. So it's really interesting coming from like the plant diagnostic world where, a lot of basic science around some of these things was actually pioneered. So, is animal science kind of the future of space? The chicken reproducing, do we start at mice and chicken, and just go up the food chain, if you will? Is that kind of ethically and functionally a really valuable pathway to?
Well, I think David brings up a really good point. We have these tourist operations such as Worldview and Space Perspective. There's a couple others in Europe as well. And it's coming to a point where our ability to control the model is going to be a loss because people are going to do what they're going to do. So I'm curious to see what happens. It's just like with NASA and booze, for instance. NASA says astronauts cannot take booze up, and the Russians say, hold my beer. They bring the booze up, and then, so we have all these ways around. I think it's it's a great quote from Jurassic Park, life finds a way.
Right.
So I think
That's
at
exactly
one point it's just going to be, hey, we did this thing, we're open to research now that we're back on the planet, surprise. And then that might be, it may be the way around this ethics issue of, we didn't tell them to do this, but they did it, so we're going to study them because they say we can. I think that may honestly end up being the most likely soon outcome.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is a great topic. We'll come back to it in a little bit because we do have, I know I hate to say that, but we do have some great weekly segments we want to get to. But stay with us because if you've liked what you've heard so far, just wait until we have our final guests on our show in just a little bit. Dun, dun, dun.
It's exciting times. Well, yes. So let's transition into a couple segments where, again, we want to highlight what's going on in the industry, right, in the space industry, as a way to just help everybody understand. Like, there's some really cool stuff going on. There's stuff going on that's impacting our daily lives that we never talk about, like space weather, right, and things like that we introduced on the first episode. So I wanted to kick it off with a segment that we're calling the Space Builders. And what I wanted to do is highlight, every episode, highlight a really cool space company that's doing something that, maybe you never would have thought of would be a thing, but it is. And it's an important key piece to being able to sustain human activity in space and beyond. And so I wanted to kick it off with a company called Cislunar Industries. And what's really cool about this company is, if you think about Andrew Carnegie, right, and the Industrial Revolution and foundries, right, that really helped pave the way for big industry and manufacturing and things like that. That's what Cislunar Industries are trying to do in space. And so, to give you a little bit of background, right now, we have to take everything with us from the surface of the Earth into space. Anything that we want to build with, and those sorts of things. And so that's expensive. It's just you got to have a big rocket. You got to load all this heavy stuff onto the rocket. You got to use all this fuel to get the rocket up into space. And so that is a limiting factor in terms of getting human beings into space, working on a regular basis, right? So what Cislunar Industries is focused on is enabling this in-space marketplace economy, and manufacturing by building foundries. So if you think about a foundry, right, you've got raw material that comes in, it melts down, and then you can the outcome is building materials, rods for building, rebar, things like that. And so that's what they're wanting to do in space. They've built these foundries, space foundries, that are modular, they're configurable, so they can be on any space station, they can be on any spacecraft, they can be on the surface of the moon, and they can take raw materials. And here's what gets cool, because see this stuff behind me, this is all space debris, right? We have a big space debris problem. And all of this is basically, covering the Earth from the outside, making it difficult for transportation. You got to be careful with, really small pieces of debris puncturing the International Space Station, or other craft that are up there, right? So wouldn't it be cool if we could find a way to recycle that material instead of just trying to let it burn up in the atmosphere? That has other implications as it relates to climate and things like that. What if we could take that material, tear it up, melt it in space, and turn it into something that we could use to build in space? And that's really what Cislunar Industries is trying to enable with their space foundry, which is so amazing. And they also are doing stuff in power, because again, this all takes power, right? It's not just fuel, it's power. We need power. There's a huge conversation about solar power right now. And so they're building power converters and ways to, basically, however much power you need, you kind of take their power units, and like Lego bricks, you kind of just put them all together and build up and down based on how much power you need. And so really amazing company, really cool in what they are enabling and what they are doing. And so I encourage you all to take a look. Cislunar, CISLUNAR industries.com. And also from a jobs perspective, these startups are looking for people. They're looking for, yes, engineers, but they're also looking for HR, marketing, sales, right? Program managers, project managers, all this stuff. And that's what we're encouraging people to do, is really consider taking your skills and applying them to this industry, because it's going to take all of us to get to where we all want to get to, which is living, working, like David said, surviving and thriving as a human race in space.
A question for you,
So,
Waldo. I've been
please.
following this for a while, and I love this idea of repurposing this junk in space, because my least favorite solution to this problem is let it deorbit. Anytime someone talks about, especially with the ISS, let's just deorbit, I'm like, let's not drop chunks of metal on people and hope for the best. There is this principle that whatever you put up, you are responsible for. It belongs to you. Whenever you're talking about harvesting this material in space and repurposing it, are there barriers as far as ownership? Do you foresee this being more like, people who've sent stuff up are just happy to have you remove that danger or that liability for them? Or do you foresee maybe them wanting to charge you for that material, or negotiating contracts? Like, how will that be navigated?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because it's multi-layered and complex.
Or are we even there yet?
Kind of. I mean, we're starting to have the conversations, because you're right. There's satellites up there, China, Russia, everybody that, more than likely there's sensitive information on those satellites, right? And so you don't want to just give those up. And so, yes, there is a question of ownership, and, are we signing over the title, sort of thing. So those are all questions which are cool, because the conversations are happening, because this is where you really start to develop an actual economy in space. Because yes, then let's say we iron all of those things out. So then you do have exchange of materials and money, because think about a salvage yard. We could have salvage yards in space so easily, where, people are bringing their defunct satellites either to be repaired or to get rid of them. And then the foundries are turning them into something else, and then we're selling that material off to somebody else, or back to the customer, or whatever, right? So it really becomes we're just taking what we've done here on Earth and recreating that in space. to enable us to do what we're doing here, which is to work and live in space.
I could see a future where there is a process in place and there is a culture of business in place to where there is an offset to launch costs by selling pre-selling the salvage contract before you even launch this thing off the ground. And maybe even that may even become a regulatory standard where we do have to have a plan to take this thing out of orbit if we're sending it to orbit. So I could imagine where it's like, we've contracted with Cislunar's salvage industry or salvage, branch to take care of this metal once we're done with it, and the contract signed. We already have prepayment, and okay, great. Now you can launch it since you have that strategy for pulling it down. So it'll be interesting to see, as business leads this kind of regulatory pocket for space.
Absolutely.
You know what I think of when you're saying all of this? I just think of like a big rocket ship with a big net, like a fisherman going out there, and they somehow just like pull everything in. And next, I don't know why that's in my mind when I'm thinking about this, but that is something that, could work, bringing everything together and having it. I guess then it's like, well, what do we do with it once the net's caught? Do we reel it in?
It wouldn't be too difficult to pop some ion propulsion drives from Morpheus on some of the salvage and just redirect it, honestly.
Absolutely. There are nets they're working on that. See, that's the beauty, right, of this industry is nets. You also have spacecraft with arms that are going out to grab this stuff. So that's all of that is happening, Meredith. So that's it's like most people imagine that, right? And it's sci-fi to them, but it's real. And that's what's so cool. And the beauty of it too is most of these companies, space is the most collaborative industry that I've ever been a part of. And that's exactly what's happening. Cislunar is one piece of the overall puzzle, and so they're partnering with all kinds of different companies to make this a reality, and that's what's really cool about it. And so, just keep an eye. If you're interested, take a look at all these space startups, see what they're doing. If you have an idea and you think it's total sci-fi, Google it, because I bet you somebody's working on something very similar. And then, hey, maybe you go work for them, right? And kind of live that lifelong dream. So, check back in next time, because we'll highlight another company and continue talking about all this cool stuff.
Well, I think we really could set a motto for the entire space industry. Like, we're in the sci-fi business. That's what we engineer. We're engineering that sci-fi future every single day.
Amazing.
Well, thank you. That's it's stuff that put things in the perspective for us that you might not have thought about, and we have these big ideas and these big dreams. And, we'll transition next into talking a little bit about space weather. And, I talked about it last time. I have a real quick summary about some hot topics, no pun intended, since, the sun is like contributing to our space weather. But I think, one of the things, and people bring this up to me all the time, they're like, well, you talk about space weather. I grabbed some notes here, and we talk about, well, how does it impact us? Because they said there's a big solar flare, but I wasn't personally impacted. And I think, like everything in the world, we have to remember that, there's going to be certain things and certain situations where we have an event that happens and it doesn't make the news. For example, I was checking out today, it's the Space Weather Prediction Center. It's great. If you want to learn more about space weather, there's a lot of educational materials on here. It talks about when we're going to have our next big solar flares. And actually, on January 23rd, we did have a radio blackout observed from a flare that came in that was warned days before. So maybe it wasn't your radio, but it was a moderate radio blocking thing. Or maybe you just noticed your radio go out for a little bit. It happened. And that is from a solar flare, which is why we continue to monitor space weather. So just stay, I'm going to try to look for these real life impacts from space weather and kind of throw them out there every month, just so you can know that there's a lot happening and why this funding for programs to work and to, get the space weather forecasting to a great level, just like our weather forecasting we're working on. And another thing that we've been talking about, and this is something which I think is fascinating, is you might have heard a lot about the solar cycle that we're in, solar cycle 25. And right now we're actually approaching the peak of it. So what does that mean? And how does this impact us here on Earth? Well, when we have a solar cycle, obviously things change. We can get more solar flares. That's going to impact us. They emit radiation that comes in UV as well as X-rays. I mean, a lot of different things, but as we know, it can cause blackouts. It can cause impacts to our astronauts in space and whatnot. So what's going to be something we have to watch closely, and why space weather forecasting is going to be important as we move toward the peak of this solar cycle. We're going to be seeing a lot more sunspots. And so what that's going to mean is a lot more of this magnetic activity happening. We're going to have a lot more solar flares. And we talk about coronal mass ejections. That's when we see this coming off the sun, and that's what's going to impact us. That's when we have those chances to see the aurora, as something that, you know, I know everybody wants to know when they're going to have that chance to see the northern lights. And so as we start to see this come up, I mean, this is going to be lasting for a little bit of time. And so right now we're kind of getting to that approach. And so we have a lot of scientists working at the Space Weather Prediction Center. Like I mentioned last month, we have a lot of funding that's going in to help improve this, because, you know, maybe we get detection in 2 to 3 days in advance, but, you know, if we could have more detection and see patterns and spot patterns, and have these scientists maybe look at something and say, hey, the sun's starting to do this. Oh, well, that's like last time when we saw the sun do that, and then we had that solar flare and we had massive disruption to our power grids. And so it's a great topic, and if you are a scientist or a weather geek like myself, or a meteorologist, and this is something you're interested in, you know, reach out to somebody at the Space Weather Prediction Center. Talk to people about how you can get involved, because I know they need more people to do it. And there are starting to be more programs now in school where you can actually have a minor or maybe even a major in space weather forecasting. And we need more people to want to be part of this initiative, because whether we notice it or not, it is impacting us here across Earth.
Meredith, is there any cool technology, or, you know, because people love their gadgets, right? And
yes,
you know, people have their temperature gauges in the house or outside, you know, with Alexa, maybe, I imagine, or any of those. Is there cool technology or cool apps that people could download or buy that helps, like, keeps track for them, like lets them know, like, daily, hey, look out for this solar flare kind of thing?
you know, that's a really good question. And I'm going to put that down for our next episode in March, because I want to do some research on that, because I know we have a lot of instruments that are currently on our satellites out there. Like the GOES satellite program has a specific instrument that focuses on space weather forecasting. So that is a great thing. Looks like Anara posted a link for us, spaceweathernews.com. So
Yeah,
check that out. I'm going to check it out because I know I want to put something on my phone. But, you know, I think that's a great link. Again, the Space Weather Prediction Center is great. And yeah, let's get more people into it and interested in it. And the more we know, the more we can, you know, spread the news, right?
Yeah. Well, and even I'm thinking too, you know, it's always fun. So, like, for example, on the Big Island in Hawaii, they have that the huge telescope, right? And there's
Right.
a bunch of amateur astronomers all set up around, and tourists can go. They can drive up to the top of the mountain there and check it out, right? Are there places like that, weather-wise, that people can go to, like, while they're on vacation, right? Because sometimes, you know, it's fun to try to find different things to do, even for, you know, if you've got kids or whatever.
Yeah.
Are there places like that where people can kind of check out, like, how do they actually do it? Because so many people love the movie Twister, you know?
Right.
And I think they're
I
doing
want
it
to,
super,
obviously.
right? Totally. Like, it's so, like, people are fascinated by it.
I
How
nearly
do they-
became a meteorologist because of that movie. And
Did you really?
in
Oh,
seventh
that's
grade
amazing.
science class, we watched Twister and Helen Hunt, phenomenal. And
Right?
then we had an entire segment for like a week and a half on space weather. And then our teacher brought in these storm chasers, and I was like, this is my life's path. I nearly became a meteorologist. So yeah, I still am really fascinated by it. But I think there's those moments we can be inspired by.
You know, there's a lot of organizations out there that have astronomy clubs, or, you know, you can
Yeah.
join an astronomy club or an astronomy group in town. So my biggest suggestion is, if you're visiting Tampa, for example, when I was living on Long Island, they have the Cradle of Aviation Museum, and they had a good partnership with a local astronomy group. So when I went to one of their events, I was able to connect to these people, and they actually had an event where they had a bunch of people with telescopes from the astronomy group come out to the museum with their telescopes, and we're letting people just go and look and learn. So I think, just check locally, see what's going on, and say, hey, are there any events coming up? My kids are interested in this, and supporting our local museums. I mean, we always talk about support local businesses and how that is something that we need to start doing a lot more, especially after the pandemic. And a lot of these companies and businesses are trying to get back on their feet. Look to the museums. A lot of them are nonprofit. And yes, they have money that comes in to keep these museums going, but if you can find a local museum, Air and Space Museum, Creative Aviation, just these companies that have access to bringing groups in, talk to them and see what's going on. And, like I said, the telescope in Hawaii is a great example. And there's other places. I know Chicago, they have I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but they have a great museum, and there's a whole thing dedicated to space. And now more of these museums are having space weather exhibits where you can bring the kids in, and it's part of the museum in general, and they can go on and touch computers or touch the screen and learn stuff. I mean, our kids more than ever, get them off the computers, get them off the iPads, get them into museums, because I think you guys can all agree. I remember being a kid and going to so many different cool museums, and that's one of the biggest things, in addition to watching movies, that sparked my interest in space and weather.
Do you remember those setups they used to have, or I think they still do, in a lot of museums where you can go in and experience weather firsthand? So you get the rain falling and the wind and the lightning above you. And my kids were fascinated by that tactile kind of interactive science. Maybe one of the things we should do is list some of these resources on the site for people to check out, like a local directory, and have them get involved. If you're out there and you run such facilities, we'd love to partner with you. So reach out to us at f4fspace.org.
That would be amazing.
Somewhat space weather related. I was at a makerspace, and they had a radio astronomy, amateur radio astronomy, which is right. You're used to telescopes and visually looking. This is radio astronomy, looking at the signals from space, and that was really interesting. Real time is this is the signal from our sun. This is the signal from some other source, and it was just live. It was just, you don't think of being bombarded from by all these radio signals from outer space. And that was just at a makerspace, by a guy who was all into this for decades. And so you'd be surprised where you can get a really interactive experience.
That reminds me of the movie Contact. You guys also remember Contact, Jodie Foster?
Absolutely.
I was like, I want to be sitting, I want to do that job too. So it's just amazing to see how many organizations, like Daniel just said, that are taking what was cinema to reality.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about wanting to do that job, I mean, there are so many jobs related to space or related to weather that could lead into space. I think we're seeing, I mean, Meredith's a perfect example of that, of taking this path and then finding her way into this industry. And so just to, again, kind of put a highlight on the fact that this industry could use anybody. If you're really interested in weather, there's a direct path into space, because more and more, and to Daniel's point about all the signals, I never really understood what the atmosphere did for us until learning how everything that's bombarding the earth, the only reason we're alive as human beings is because of our atmosphere, because of what it filters out that could be, deadly to us, and vice versa. And so it's just, I don't know, there's so many cool things. So, all right, let's move on. Excellent conversation so far. I'm loving every minute of this. Now we're going to go into the Rocket Girl report with Meredith. Meredith, I turn it over to you.
Well, this is something that we're going to start doing every month. And as you know, I have a background in journalism. And so the Rocket Girl report is going to be something we have every month, where as a group, we take the topic of the month and we come up with a question where we want you to get involved. You probably see a lot of reporters out. We call them man on the street. We're out there, we're interviewing you in person, we're asking you questions because we want to get the feedback of the general public. Well, because we can't be everywhere across the country at all times, we are inviting anybody that's watching this to go to our website and to find out what the question is. And we'll be posting it every month on social media so you can know. And then we want you, horizontal video, not vertical, that way we can edit it for this show. We want you to maybe record yourself doing a 30 to 45 second video reacting to what the question is. So for example, if our question is, what do you want to see more out of space weather? We just want you to send us your response, And you don't even have to give us your last name. You could say, hi, I'm Bobby from Portland, Oregon, and here's what I think. Because the more you get involved in the segment, the more we can get the experts on our show to help answer those questions you have. Or like we talked about before, making sure we're getting the facts out there. That way people can make educated decisions based on what we might be seeing on social media or things that may not be true. So for this week's question, obviously we've been talking a lot about reproduction in space and sex in space. So we thought that our question of the week would be, what do you think would be the most challenging thing about sex in space? And here's what some of you thought.
It's funny because when I asked my friends this question, and some of them are rocket scientists, like literal rocket scientists.
You are muted.
Oh no. Okay, while he's fixing it, all right, Daniel, what were your immediate reactions to those answers and those questions?
I'm just excited to see people digging into this with us. It's good to see that the public wants to engage. But with a topic like sex, I think it's easy. We're going to create a bridge into space quite easily because it's something we all deal with for sure. And I have to say happy Valentine's Day, of course, to everyone out there.
Yes.
And it's funny because when I asked my friends this question, and a lot of them are literal rocket scientists, all I got were like memes or, GIFs back of like David from Schitt's Creek going, ew, like stuff like, why are you asking us that question? Are you crazy? So it's just really funny to see how people think about this kind of stuff.
Daniel?
Yeah,
no, he's like,
so from a plant, so from a plant perspective, I mean, I remember teaching my kids reproduction through, plants. Here's a cell from, the mama plant, here's a cell from the data plant, and here it is, converted. So I think very scientifically about, okay, there's the sex, and then there's the reproduction. So the reproduction aspect of it, it's almost two different categories for me, but very fascinating subject.
I mean, this is great. And, in just a few minutes, we're going to have an expert on this topic when she joins us. It's going to be really interesting to hear, some of the questions we might have had to get those answers to, because like we said, I know sometimes it is the, oh, tee, like we're talking about sex, but reality is reality. That is how, as a society, we reproduce. Someone gets married, they have a child, they're putting the family name forward. So actually our guest has just arrived, and so we are so excited to introduce her. And as part of the Rocket Girl Report this week, I am very excited. I want to get her bio in so I can announce that first. We have Shauna Pandya. Is it Pandya? Just to make sure I'm correct.
Pandya.
Shauna Pandya, we're so happy to have you here. She is a physician, aquanaut, scientist, astronaut candidate with the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences. This is so cool, right? Skydiver, pilot in training, VP Immersive Medicine with Luxonic Technologies, and the director of IAS Space Medicine Group. She was one of the first crew to test a commercial spacesuit in zero gravity in 2015 and earned her aquanautic designation on the 2019 Neptune, which is Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration mission. Also completed a second aquanautic mission, NEP-2NE. But if that's not enough for you, then why she's a great guest on our show, she also has publications that include a paper on medical guidelines for commercial suborbital spaceflight, book chapters on space technologies that have benefited terrestrial medicine, psychological resilience in long-duration spaceflights, and reproduction, sexuality, and long-duration spaceflight. Her work's permanently exhibited at the Ontario Science Centre along Dr. Roberta Bondar, the first Canadian woman in space. And in 2022, she was named to the Explorers Club, 50 Explorers Changing the World. Her work has also been profiled by the Nature and the Royal Canadian Mint. Shauna, welcome to our show. What a fun topic, right? Just in time for Valentine's Day.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Meredith. I'm really excited to be here. I think we're going to have a good conversation today.
We
And can I
are.
just
So
say, I want to be you when I grow up. Phenomenal. All the amazing things you're doing. I think we have a lot of really cool sci-fi, heroines out there and role models. Samantha Carter has nothing on you.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
That's so awesome. Well, Shauna, we're going to dive right in. We know your background. We've just had a couple of really good comments from our viewers, addressing the whole, what do you see are the biggest challenges in space? So I guess, what is your reaction, first off, to when you hear people have this conversation? And personally, what do you as an expert see would be our biggest challenges when it comes to reproduction or sex in space?
Oh man, how much time do we have? Yeah, so there's a lot of considerations when we talk about sexuality and reproduction in space, and why the conversation is important is we are in this golden age of increasing accessibility and democratizing access to space. So we've seen since 2021, we've seen this real exponential rise in commercial human spaceflight with Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin on the suborbital front, with SpaceX, Axiom on the orbital front, and there's more players all the time. I'm an advisor to Above Space Development Corporation. So there's all of these new players. There's Nix, there's Gravitics, there's Vast. So, but that's all a very long-winded way of saying that, our goal is to get humans to space. But now that we're changing the profile of missions from space agency based, from being funded by government to having these mandates of exploration and science and technical achievement, it's going to change to leisure and experimentation. And so, there's these proposals for space hotels. We all know what people do in space hotels on Earth. And it's going to be pretty hard to mandate what people can and can't do in space, especially if they're paying all this money to be able to go and have an out of this world experience. And humans are competitive. Someone's going to want to be the first to tick that box of reproduction in space. So then where do the challenges come in? It's everything from the psychology of attraction. In the International Space Station right now, it's a confined space, it's closed. You're not showering, you're doing a sponge bath every now and then. There's all this particulate matter floating around as it is. So your bodily hair, your whatever you're flossing, that's, picked
Wait,
up.
what? I didn't
So,
even I just know. Okay, makes sense.
They did a very real photo of what it's like to go to space. One of the astronauts I once watched in lecture said that when they were up there, they banned their crewmates from flossing in space because they did not want that matter they didn't want to get that in their eye. They didn't want to encounter that. So, let's extrapolate a little bit and talk about, there's of course filters. These are ideally picked up by the ISS filtration systems. But there's the hygiene aspect. There's the arousal and attraction aspect. There's the gymnastics of trying to copulate and pair up in zero G. And just to give you an idea, there's even guidelines for doing chest compression, CPR in space, because unless you're Velcroing yourself down to the patient, unless you're attaching yourself to them, unless you're fixing yourself to the station and doing chest compressions, you're going to go flying to the other end of the station. So now, we try to kind of extrapolate on that and say, okay, we want to have intercourse. We want to copulate. Okay, well, we need to think of creative ways to be able to do that successfully. And then we don't have enough information on human gamete production for females or males, especially for females in space. They're only 11% of the astronaut population to date. And then in utero development from from implantation to embryo development to in utero development, and then labor and delivery in space. I mean, it's scary enough on Earth. Everything can go wrong. Imagine having to perform a crash C-section in the zero-G environment. So that's a long-winded way of saying there are a lot of considerations when we talk about this whole topic of sexuality and reproduction in space. But that's just a little flavoring of kind of what myself and my colleagues look into.
So considering the challenges, would you say, though, that this particular conversation in general is like a big sign that says, hey, you know what? Space is happening now. We're talking about sex in space, having kids in space, right? Do you think that's a big sign, or could be, right, from a messaging perspective that says, hey, you know what? Space is happening. We're talking about this right now. Space is happening. Is that, could that be true?
For me, the sign is more red, full of sirens, and very, very loud. It's also a
Yeah.
warning sign that we should have been talking about this 5 years ago when
Yeah.
it was still theoretical. Because the nature of exponential change is that by the time that we think that, hey, maybe we should find out about this whole space business, we should find out about AI and ChatGPT, like we're already behind the curve. And so if we wanted to have mindful policy around how we can responsibly and ethically approach the situation, the best time to do it would have been 5 years ago. The next best time is to do it now and in a very mindful, interdisciplinary, nuanced fashion. And so I say that because, say someone is committed to, having, to conceiving in space. Maybe it's fine, or maybe we know that something about the spaceflight environment encourages mutations that aren't compatible with life, or that leads to mutations in a viable fetus, which would be nice to know ahead of time. So there's all of these considerations, and we need to approach this from not just the physician's perspective, not just from the OBGYN perspective, but from the physiology perspective, from the psychology perspective, from the bioethicist perspective. It's been something that I've been involved with for years now, and it's nice to see that there's more and more voices coming to the table from different disciplines, because we really do want to make sure we are committed to seeing this future of humanity being this permanent off-world multiplanetary species, but that implies procreation, right? So we need to come back to step one and say, okay, let's see how we're going to do this. How are we going to get there? How are we going to do so mindfully and ethically?
I think one of the problems with space, we have this broad overall messaging issue where the public often doesn't have a clue what we're doing, and they haven't really engaged with us. And so when I talk to the public, oftentimes I get this weird number. I don't know where it's published, but somehow 1,000 years seems to be a lot of the consensus. Oh, that's 1,000 years away. Isn't that 1,000 years away? Aren't we going to space way in the future? But it's happening right now. And I think the issue with that messaging is that when we're talking about these things which are very scary and very taboo and very cutting edge, sometimes the instinct is, oh, that's too far. We really shouldn't be doing that. I get a lot of people who are scared of new technology or new processes, or even in the transhumanist world, like, that's going outside of the realm of who we are as humans. And how do we, bridge that gap with the public? And I'm imagining also that this creates a lot of ethics barriers, because there's only so much we can do on the planet. How do we get from, testing these potentials on the ground and then moving into that, what's going to be a big backlash of humans reproducing in space as that first test in reality?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So to back up a little bit, there has been animal research. There's been salamander and quail egg and mice and rat research. There has been no, well, even I should back up. There are some human studies on testosterone function, and there is some anecdotal descriptions of, were males able to be more aroused or less aroused in space, and even that data is conflicting. And the background reason is because, well, in 0G, the blood flow is altered, so maybe we won't be able to have as good an erection in theory, and then the anecdotal experience is the exact opposite. And so, coming back to your question, it's so critical to proceed about this in a way that's very stepwise and mindful. And at some point, I would love to see primate studies. And right now, for ethical reasons, there is a ban, a moratorium on performing primate studies for very good reason, but there are exceptions. And so, for example, we saw with Neuralink, we don't want to make the leap from going from mice to humans, for example, with Neuralink. Same with reproduction in space. I think, getting more information from animals, getting more data on primates, and then also studying, even before we get to reproduction, knowing more about women's health, knowing more about menstruation in space. Most female astronauts, again, them being in the minority, choose to take oral contraception to suppress their periods as well. So we don't know much about menstruation in space as well. So there's a whole bunch of threads to pull on there.
When I think we
And I
have
think-
this structure, sorry, go ahead, Meredith.
No, I was going to say, I think, let's face it, a lot of people see stuff and TV shows and the movies, they think, oh, that's reality. This is going to be easy. And I think maybe if this is something that we are working on, having documentaries, getting more people from all sorts, even including OBGYN doctors, to say, hey, you know what, this is something that we need to talk about. So let's get some facts out there versus the fiction of these movies that makes it seem fun and just like, oh, that's a challenge I want to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other challenge is, like, we know that the pharmacodynamics, the pharmacokinetics of medications in space are altered, right? So right now, oral contraceptives ostensibly work for period suppression. Are they as effective for birth control, right? Because if we're going under that assumption and that's not the case, so all of a sudden we have a whole new challenge on our hands, and potentially lawsuits and counter lawsuits where, a drug manufacturer is sued because their product didn't work, and then they can countersue while saying, well, we never said it would work in space. So it's just this whole minefield of all these potential conflicts that we need to identify and work on deconflicting.
Now, there are these tourism opportunities popping up as far as worldview and space perspective, which are, they're slower and there's more time. You get 6 hours on orbit, I think it is, with worldview, and people are going to do what they're going to do. Like you said, people want to, someone wants to be the first. And we have this trajectory where, we can predict, like with astronauts and scientists and regulated sort of spaces, we can, sort of set that timeline. But when it comes to tourism, we don't really have a lot of control there, and something may happen. How do we, how do we mediate that? Is there some way that we can control the progress on the tourism side, or do you expect basically for this to happen and then we'll be able to study them as they come back?
Right now, it's a bit of a race, because if we had been mindful about this from the start and had mindful policy and guidelines, I think we would have been a bit more prepared. There, with the rise of all of these companies, there's different environments, there's different gravity environments, there's different altitudes, there's different radiation exposures, there's different profiles. There's a whole lot of opportunity for study. I think, we do need to be very not mindful, but very assertive about kind of suggesting the publicizing the land of unintended consequences, the potential downfalls of progressing without a care in the world when it comes to reproduction in space. And then I think there is a way to engage civilian astronauts and say, hey, do you want to be part of this roadmap for humanity? Do you want to help us deconstruct this problem? And historically, every civilian astronaut, every civilian explorer that I've met wants to go with a purpose. They don't want to just go for a joyride. They want to participate in science and discovery and research. So, that's the silver lining here is now we're about to have a whole new demographic, ostensibly a larger demographic, and one that is very keen on participating. So hopefully everything is looking up figuratively and literally.
Well, and I have one last question before we bring Egbert on. The forward movement of this, do you expect basically someone to kind of break that rule and then the gate's been opened and then we can talk about, people have done this, the gate is open, we didn't cause this, or is it more proactive? Do you intend to maybe reach out and say, hey, here's a free flight, who wants to reproduce in space in a tourism environment? I mean, where do you have that ability to kind of push that, or do you have to wait for someone to break that taboo?
No, I think both are equally possible. It's a matter of time, of resources, but someone is always going to want to be the first. So whether we say, don't do it, oh, you've already done it, okay, let's study this, versus, okay, let's study this, and here are the parameters, the experimental parameters that, what we would like to find out. Here's our variable control and or here are our, our interventions, and here's what we're studying. It's equally possible, and I think there's going to be data that we can study either way, as long as everyone is willing. So consent is going to be a huge part of this, and we have to do everything very, very in a very considered fashion.
Coming at this from an agricultural scientist standpoint, I look at, the historical context of agriculture and civilization as it was very much large scale agriculture and then civilization on a large scale. And I think this is interesting because I think it's way ahead of the curve. It's okay, well, how do you create the resources to support, right, a new life in space, right? How do you create that thriving environment there? And, I think it's great that we're having these conversations, I think actually early, because, we're not talking about yet staying in space. We're talking about historical first, going up, not actually caring for and raising someone in space.
Yeah, and there's also a resource allocation consideration that comes up. So say, we sent a crew of 6 to Mars on a government-sponsored mission, and then before long, it turns out that, 2 of the astronauts have paired up. Someone is pregnant, and there's a 6 to 9 month return journey to come back from Mars. And so if we, by the time we send help and then bring the crew back, they will already have delivered. And so, there's, aside from the considerations of what it's like to gestate and deliver in 1/3 gravity.
Oh, we lost you there. Yeah, your volume's not coming in.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. What was the last thing you heard?
Oh, Daniel, you're muted.
Gestate in 1/3 gravity was the last thing.
Okay, yeah. So perfect. That was kind of where I had close to where I'd left off. So, say you do give birth in 1/3 gravity, your crew size is now 7. And so that in the context of resources, do you have the food and the water and the closed loop life support system to support that? And then in terms of mission operations, maybe mom is going to need she's definitely going to need to spend some time with child. Maybe she wants maternity leave as well. Maybe dad wants paternity leave as well. So then it's leaving the other 4 of the crew to take on their tasks as well and work a little bit harder. Maybe there's some resentment. There's so many psychosocial dynamics to consider as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think this is a great time to bring in our next guest to join the conversation. Egbert Edelbrook from Spaceborne United. You've heard us talk about Spaceborne quite a bit already. They're really the company taking on the topic of reproduction in space. And Egbert, I'll let you kind of fill us in on exactly kind of the work that you all are doing. So first of all, thank you, welcome, and I hand you the baton.
It's a pleasure to be here. A pleasure to see a few familiar faces. Always great to join the stage, or digital or physically, with Shauna, obviously. So Spaceborne United we started 6 years ago, and the name Spaceborne United is a hint for our very long-term goal to someday also enable something like childbirth in space, or maybe someday even the 9-month cycle. But of course, it's a step-by-step process, and we start at the beginning, the conception stage, and the very early embryo development. And obviously also starting with animal models, mammalian gametes and embryos, before we are allowed, and before it's ethically reasonable to transition to work with human gametes. And what we do is like 3 things. So we started with looking at the existing research around the conditions for safe stages of reproduction in different space environments. And the second main thing is we translated the outcomes of the research into a missions program that enables the studying of these different stages of reproduction. And the third thing that is, I think, our focus for around 80% of the time now is to develop technology for these missions. And that is focusing on these first two stages. So conception and early embryo development. And we're not building it from scratch. We're using, our starting point is existing technology from the IVF sector. So in vitro fertilization clinics, they have equipment like an embryo incubator. On Earth, this is used for embryo selection for people who have problems getting pregnant in a natural way. This embryo incubator can help select the most viable embryos for reimplantation, but we use it as a platform, as a life support system. And we re-engineered it, we miniaturized it, we automated it to make it work in space. And because we want the embryos to experience initially Earth-like gravity, we also added artificial gravity. So by using a microfluidic disc, I actually have an old prototype here. I think I can show.
Yeah, I saw this. I saw this when you at New Worlds, the New Worlds conference. I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating. Yeah, feel free to hold it up though, because it's
So
yes, let's see it.
Yeah.
Let's also show it with the logo.
Yeah, there you go.
On the outside,
you've heard of the cradle of life. This is the disc of life.
Yeah,
Oh, I love
this is
it.
where the magic is about to happen. This is an older prototype. We're working on all these iterations. But on the outside, in the reaction chambers, there will be the embryos developing. And by rotating the disc, the embryos will experience a certain gravity level. And we can adjust the rotation speed to let the embryos experience Earth-like gravity, or Mars-like gravity, moon gravity, and all the other partial gravity areas. And so it's important, our longer-term goal is to study especially partial gravity effects, like the Martian gravity environments, because if we want to become a multiplanetary species, and we want those human settlements to really become independent from Earth, that implies you also address the reproductive challenge. And we don't know, nobody knows what the partial gravity effects, the Martian gravity effects will do with developing embryos. It might be sufficient, it might not be. And you don't want to find out on Mars. That's crazy, complex and expensive. So what we do is we have this small space lab, like a small shoebox size mini lab, which is the life support system that facilitates the embryo development and the conception, and we can study all the different gravity effects. So and it's designed to operate inside a small satellite, an unmanned small satellite, so everything is automated. And this small satellite orbits the Earth for a 5 to 6 day mission in case of mammalian gametes, and 1 day longer for when we can move towards human gametes, because the gestation is taking a little bit longer. And then it's also meant to bring the embryos back to Earth for examination. And the healthy embryos, we want to place them back in the mice wombs to check for things like, all the things you want to check, including transgenerational effects. So will the offspring create offspring themselves, and will they be healthy, etc.
I think when it comes to space messaging, for me, there are two big corridors. One is those who understand the value and kind of the path towards space. And so when we're talking about this, the value here is really easy. It's, we're going to go to space. You want us to be there. That's really where, humanity is going to flourish. And so we need this critical work for sex and reproduction in space. The other group is the group that doesn't quite get space, and they want to know what you're going to do for Earth. And so we have this kind of mental gymnastics or messaging gymnastics where a lot of space organizations and companies kind of have to sell the benefit of what we're doing in space for Earth. Can you talk about how your research for these movements into space is coming back to Earth and changing things here and making an impact on the planet?
Absolutely. So I run into all the details of the technology, but the why I kind of went a little bit quickly. So we have two main goals, two strategic goals. The longer term goal is to help space exploration becoming multiplanetary. I already explained it a little bit. But the on-Earth benefit from our research is improving fertility on Earth, especially IVF treatment and IVF hardware. You can imagine if you have a reason to really miniaturize things and automate steps in the process, that is already expected to create benefits to improve IVF hardware on Earth, but also doing the conception and embryo development in different gravity environments is expected to result in different insights, and some of them should be transferable to improve the biological process. And that's extra important because there's a lot of people with fertility issues. These numbers are growing also because there's the international trend that women more often want to choose a focus on the career first, and later on think about starting a family. And obviously, their biology is not really helping that, and that means they will more often rely on fertility treatment and assisted reproductive technologies like IVF. And also, governments internationally, insurance companies, they're supporting this. So they're more often reimbursing IVF treatment costs. So that is boosting this trend even more. And there's obesity epidemics like everywhere. That's also not helping the fertility rates. So there's even more trends, but just to give you a few examples of why this is becoming even more important to address this, and that's we're very happy that we are not just having a business case on Earth, but we're also contributing to empower women to have better careers and to have more options. And it's perfectly fine for those who don't have ambitions in that direction, but more and more women have. So we're happy to support that a little bit.
And for both our guests, we talk a lot about the messaging with the public, but with the industry, you talked about how the space tourism industry didn't really understand or think about this, or didn't have any forethought. What's it like for both of you reaching out to the industry and all these different companies? Do you have to help them understand that they need a strategy that incorporates this, especially when we're talking about sending people to space, whether that be scientifically or through tourism? What's that relationship building like, or how do you bridge that gap with these different space companies to get them to understand or prioritize this? And I ask specifically because I feel like a lot of space companies have a lot on their plate, and they're often very narrow-minded or narrow-visioned on their primary goals. And so these kind of residual things that are really important are missed. Has it been a struggle for you to get them to incorporate that into their vision?
Well, I think Shauna can go into more of the details, but in general, to focus for a minute on the space tourism sector, it's really surprising what you're saying. The narrow-mindedness, apparently, it's really surprising to us that they seem to be quite unaware of the risks that their clients, their guests, are being exposed to if they're not guided and or warned for the potential implications of trying to create the first in space conceived baby or something. But the medical problematic side of this, I think Shauna can explain that much better.
Yeah, interestingly, some fun sex and space trivia is that early on in the infancy of these commercial companies, there was, of course, seeing the opportunity for both entertainment and monetization. There was a Scandinavian adult entertainment company that wanted to be the first to film an adult film in space, and oddly enough, they propositioned Virgin Galactic, who said no. I was like, know your audience. The branding there isn't quite right. And so there was an early no to that. Now, I think the philosophy is going to depend on the company. And so we're not here to tell anyone what to do. We're here to be very multidimensional about the land of unintended consequences. In what directions this can go. And so Egbert made an interesting point that I was hoping he would touch on about, are there transgenerational effects? And the other question is, well, even if offspring in generation 1 is totally fine and there's no differences at the macro level, do these changes, do they accrue over time? And after multiple generations of procreation on Mars, do you suddenly have a totally divergent species that is a sister species to humanity, but totally unable to procreate with them? So there's lots of considerations and rabbit holes we can go down. And so, we're always happy to continue the conversation, expand the conversation, have whoever wants to be there at the table on the agency side, on the commercial space company side. It's going to require multiple perspectives, and it's just a conversation that needs to not just continue, but be expanded on multiple fronts.
So, and we want to welcome back David Cullen. I think this is a great opportunity to have all three of you, kind of bounce off each other on a conversation. I want to bring up something that's controversial currently on Earth, which is, this idea of gene editing and, and that sort of thing. Shauna, you were just talking about kind of the natural possibility of mutation based on, where somebody gets pregnant, the transgenerational. What about the very much so deliberate aspect of this, right? Where, where we're editing the embryo or the DNA prior to birth. Like, what is that? How much of that is part of the conversation? And, this is for everybody.
Yeah, that hasn't, it has been part of the conversation from my perspective yet. Definitely, I'm sure Egbert has a different perspective. But there's this great paper from the MIT review circa 2016, 2017 that makes the argument that if we're not genetically enhancing astronauts and then sending them into this high risk, high radiation environment where their bones are just going to lose density, then that's unethical as well. And so it may, there's a lot of considerations. So if we are sending humans to Mars in this for prolonged exposure in higher energy radiation, then we need to protect them. If it turns out that we can viably reproduce in space, but for whatever reason, the offspring are not viable or they're sterile, and all of a sudden we don't have an option to stay on Earth, then our hand is forced. Then we absolutely need to be synthesizing and editing genes to ensure the longevity of our species. So there's, that's an extreme case, but it's, there are, to present the viewpoint that there are certain circumstances in which it's absolutely necessary and even a survival imperative. And then even on Earth, we look at gene editing therapies for cancer treatments. So there is, it can definitely be a slippery slope. There can be, even as early as the 90s, dating myself a little bit, there was this concern for, designer babies, and then that's going to it leads to this very nefarious, almost eugenicist type of conversation. And so it's important to have this very frank conversation, but there's certain circumstances in which gene editing would be a necessity.
Yeah, Egbert or David?
So from my point of view, and I think I mentioned it earlier in terms of kind of ultimately getting Earth society approval for this, not going off and doing things kind of completely independently of kind of Earth, but ultimately doing things and trying to get Earth society approval, and therefore using existing frameworks or evolved frameworks in terms of ethics committees and all these kind of things that to kind of represent kind of broad societal views. So I think there's a need to get those, and I think those ultimately are looking at the kind of risk versus benefit ratio. And so I think you see the situation where if there is no immediate threat to kind of life on Earth becoming extinct, and therefore you're assuming that kind of kind of the Earth is going to remain for multiple generations a reasonably habitable environment, then of course the risk of kind of allowing kind of humans to kind of reproduce in space, or to be gene edited to try and reproduce more in space, feels like the kind of the societal gain is not worth the risks. But suddenly, if there was something which says that there's a 99% chance that in 100 years we're going to be hit by a massive asteroid, there's no way that we're going to be able to kind of deflect it, then suddenly the benefit, the risk versus benefit ratio suddenly changes, and you suddenly would have Earth society saying, actually no, now we do think that the risks of kind of things going wrong on an individual level is worth it for the overall societal gain. So I think that's perhaps a way of adding a little bit more kind of rigor to the argument and such, in that without that kind of relatively immediate, in terms of 1 or 2 generations, high probability that life on Earth is going to kind of cease, then I think there isn't going to be the immediate societal kind of benefit to outweigh the risk to allow suddenly space to rapidly kind of move ahead. More likely, space is going to benefit from whatever's become the norm in terms of medical treatments on Earth, and therefore then just translate those across. That would be my view. Obviously, it's still all very much speculation.
One very interesting, and I fully agree with both Shauna and David about the ethical approach that this requires, but the issue is also that there's countries or groups that have another moral compass, and if you look at history, in almost all cases of when there was new technology, it has been used by some groups, and it evolved. And now that CRISPR is on the plate, it's on the table, Pandora's box seems to have opened, and you cannot close it anymore. Even so, even if the Western world or whatever groups have these high ethical standards, we may have to be considerate about the option that other groups will, in our view, abuse it or do their ethical homework not so well. One other point, I think some of you may be aware of the work of Christopher Mason, top genetics experts, and he wrote this book, The Next 500 Years, subtitle, Using Gene Editing to Reach Other Worlds. And he describes, well, obviously scientific rock solid scenarios that how space exploration can strongly benefit from all of this. But of course, he's a very ethical guy as well. So yeah, that's my input here.
Well, before we break, I just want to throw one more thing out there. Is there a regulatory body? Are people forming regulatory bodies over this topic? And if not, is that something that your consortium writing this green paper, do you hope to structure that regulatory pathway?
So if you come back to the green paper, then we are saying there needs to be discussions among the community to work out some of these uncertainties where the current regulatory frameworks are not clear cut. So, for example, just the legal frameworks for operating in space are, I mean, not just for what we're talking about here, but for lots of other disciplines, the view is that they are not particularly well developed. They've not evolved as quickly as the technology has, and therefore there's catching up. So we certainly are encouraging that the community looks to how they can either exploit, kind of use or modify existing structures, be that coming from the space legal framework or coming that from the kind of human reproduction kind of legal frameworks, which obviously differ from, as Egbert says, from country to country. And again, how do they project into space? Are they simply linked to where the spacecraft is launched from? If it's being recovered to a different country, again, where does the kind of legal kind of jurisdiction of the kind of humans ethics and kind of reproduction kind of panels lie? So there's still lots of unknowns, but some of these is just working with what's already there and clarifying the kind of interactions and not necessarily generating completely new approaches. So we recommend that, but we don't give any detailed kind of guidance as to what it should be, like in the green paper.
Yeah, and then to answer the question about the consortium, one of our colleagues who isn't here today, Dr. Alex Landecker, he's one of the world's first astrosexologists. He has his PhD in astrosexology, which I didn't think was a thing until I met Dr. Landecker. He and I co-authored a book chapter on this. He's also on that green paper as well, if I recall correctly. So, you know, he has founded the Astrosexological Research Institute dedicated to answering these questions, bringing in the molecular geneticists, the physicians, the entrepreneurs, the psychologists, to have these discussions. So there, you know, there wasn't a framework, there was a need for it, and now we're building the spacecraft on the way up, as it were.
I had one other parallel, working in agriculture, the adoption of genetically modified organisms, right? You had all these genetically engineered crops, and it was very controversial. Did a country adopt these or did they not? And going back to that risk versus reward, you know, it's been interesting watching that shift, you know, specifically in the scientific community where you had people on both sides of the issues. And then governmentally and from
that's such a key point. Sorry to jump in, because, you know, I never fully understood the hate against GMOs, because look at the original, like the OG banana. It was not edible. Like, it had a massive seed. There was very little fruit. Like, we were genetically modifying fruits and any type of food before there was even a term for this. So the messaging, the storytelling about how we go forth as a species and procreate in space is going to be so critical, because if there is this smear campaign about what are we trying to do to humanity, are we trying to totally mutate humanity, are we trying to just do this for a joyride, you know, we're going to be swimming across against the tide in an already very complex field. So the storytelling and the messaging is key, and, you know, having so many different players from all these different disciplines and telling you know, the different stories and perspectives is going to be so critical going forward.
And I fully agree, because again, obviously I'm based in Europe, and so therefore in Europe, GMOs in terms of agricultural crops aren't really widely available. And of course, it comes down to that messaging and who wins in terms of kind of controlling the narrative. And in Europe, one of the issues was the media came up with negative stories, and they came up with a really key catchphrase, which was Frankenstein foods. And that sums it up in one word. And that kept getting used in the media, and therefore that affected kind of public perception, which meant that in the end, kind of in Europe, it was from the very early stages of that, the narrative was kind of driven by the story that was it was always labeled Frankenstein food. So whenever somebody was on kind of talking about it, they was always having to defend, well, but it's Frankenstein foods. So they were always on the back foot. Whereas I think in the US, that narrative never really developed in the same way. So I think it was Meredith who mentioned it kind of in our conversation earlier about how messaging and how the general media that can go in all kinds of ways and really drive the outcome. And in a way that, if we're not aware of it, the kind of more technology-driven people can really fall foul of kind of getting their technology kind of implemented.
Well, and I think about the example of Bill Nye. Bill Nye is a very popular science explainer, very much interfaces with the public, and he was vehemently opposed to GMO foods, and he was kind of on a warpath to speak out against GMO foods, and then Monsanto gave him a private tour of their facility, their operations, the technology, and he came away not only not vehemently opposed, but quite in favor of securing a much better, a much more stable human future through the ability to, draft our genetic, I guess, really with the ability to create that genetic future for our food and keep it stable. So he got the messaging, and I think a lot of people followed along that journey. And we had a lot of these kind of moments where that they turned that corner because somebody really important got it for them.
Right. And I think that's where the responsibility comes in as we wrap up this show today, where if you're watching and you're somebody that, in addition to Shauna and David and Egbert, which thank you guys so much for coming on today, if this is something you're passionate about, or somebody that has facts and has resources. You know, we need to get these people out there. We need to get these people talking and confronting people that maybe don't have the right idea of what's going on, or things are blurred. So part of wrapping up this show as well is we want to encourage everybody who has watched today to join the conversation. Go to our website, which we have provided for you in the link below. We want to hear what your thoughts are, and we want to know it if there's somebody that, you know, needs to speak up or needs to come on a show like this. And so thank you everybody for contributing to such a great topic today. And hopefully I think everybody leaves today with a little bit more information and knowledge to say, yes, this is a big topic and we can't be shy or giggly about it. It's something that needs to be had to help the future of this planet and multiplanetary societies as well.
Awesome. Thank you all very much.
Well, I want to say happy Valentine's Day to everyone. And
Yes.
hopefully we'll have a Valentine's Day celebration in space relatively soon.
Yes.
Thanks for having
Thanks
us.
for our
Appreciate
guests
it.
for being
Happy
here.
Valentine's.
Yes. Thank you all. Take care.
I hope there's a host to introduce us again or explain the discontinuity in what we're wearing.
I think I'm nicely matched. Not that I deliberately tried to. It's just fortuitous that I think I'm almost identically dressed.
I think everybody looks good. So what a great show we had today, and so excited to have the guests back here with us. This is the fun part now. This is anybody that's watching that has questions, you know, on LinkedIn, here in the chat. We have some of our experts here live and ready to talk. And so happy pre-Valentine's Day, I guess. Anything anyone else wants to add? You know, for both of our guests, we're so excited to have you guys join us, but I don't know if there's anything, you know, kind of since we started this conversation, if you wanted to bring up or any updates from when this was previously recorded.
David, did we reveal the symposium plans? Was that during this webinar?
I can't remember what I talked about now because I only watched the last kind of 10 minutes.
No, that was during Chris, the Humanity in Deep Space.
Yeah, so
But let's reveal it here as well then.
Yeah, go for it.
So thanks to also Dave Cullen and the paper that he co-authored as a lead author, actually. We were invited by Rick Tumlinson to organize with him a special symposium, a 2-day expert symposium about reproduction in space. And we were very excited, so we embraced this opportunity and we started preparing this. And we intend to invite all the relevant experts in the world to this invitation-only symposium to basically work on defining the roadmap for reproduction in space for the next few decades.
Oh, wow.
That's,
Where
I think, an interesting
do you have the
update.
details?
Well, okay, so this discussion about exactly what the title of this should be, and so there has been some debate as to whether actually it's really covering two things, which in reality kind of merge together as a continuum. That is kind of human reproduction in space, but also sexual health in space. So there was some discussion as to whether actually the remit is going to be kind of human reproduction and sexual health in space. Because although there perhaps are two different communities interested in those two topics, in reality, they do form just one continuum of the whole question about the kind of future of kind of humanity in space in terms of both reproduction and obviously sexual health.
Absolutely, I almost forgot. And the practical perspective, we're aiming for Houston Space Center for the location. And we're aiming for early October. And it will be combined with the New Worlds conference that will be directly afterwards. That's the aim, but we're in the early stage of organizing. We have some very interesting confirmations from high-level speakers. But again, it's not going to be so much about speaking, but much more about workshops where experts work together on other topics.
That's phenomenal. I mean, I think it's it's so great to continue to see this area of study really start taking off. It's much needed conversation, and we look forward to supporting in any way, of course, and spreading the word, as they say. So very cool. Well, do we love to know, like, what questions does anybody have? Like, did anything come up since we recorded the show? I mean, obviously this conference, this 2-day symposium is exciting update since then. What else is on the horizon for the both of you in regards to this?
Well, I suppose from my point of view, there's two aspects. It's obviously kind of working with the kind of network of people that Spaceport's brought together to advance a number of strands, or to continue advancing a number of strands that I think was part of the discussion kind of in the recording. And then if you want to kind of flip it the other way, literally what are the kind of things which have been happening, for example, today, and it's possibly because of the fact that Valentine's Day is kind of coming up, then for some reason there seems to be a spike in kind of people contacting me from the media, kind of looking for different kind of questions because of articles they're writing, or in one case a TV program that some producers are thinking of putting together, and so there seems to be a little spike, and I was just assuming that it's because it's Valentine's Day and therefore kind of things like this are perhaps on kind of people's minds a bit more in terms of kind of journalists, the kind of TV production community. So that gives you the two ends of the kind of spectrum.
Very cool. So that's exciting to see. Have you ever seen that much attention on this topic from the media?
Yes, because remember, we were inundated just under a year ago when we put the original press release out to go along with the fact that we published the original green paper, and obviously there was kind of, but to some extent it's obvious because of the nature of the topic. It's something that appeals both to people in relevant technical kind of ethical, if you want, kind of the people directly involved in this, but also, of course, the topic is broadly a kind of interest to the general population and therefore the kind of general media. And so it was to some extent inevitable that if we put something out like this, we were going to attract both that kind of general kind of interest, kind of interaction with the media, as well as the more specialized interest. Yeah. So obviously it was kind of like, it was April last year. Clearly there was a massive spike then, and only over the past couple of days, there's just a few coming in, so it's nowhere near the same level of interest. Yeah, fascinating. And Egbert, what about you? So right now you're planning for the symposium. Anything in terms of space-related activity that you all have on the horizon that you can talk about?
Yeah, we're all the time working on space-related topics. I was just looking up some YouTube clip from the Jimmy Kimmel show, the Sex in Space tour, uncontrolled conception, and Sex in Space paper was on the. You can even show it to everyone here if you like. I put the link in the chat.
Yeah, April, can we throw that up real quick? Just do a quick share.
Because in the terms of that kind of really high impact general media, there was two things. The UK, I managed to get a story on the front page of one of the kind of daily papers to do with sex in space, associated with that press release kind of April last year. And then the other one, which Egbert is talking about, is it was picked up, obviously from, again, a general media kind of light-hearted kind of viewpoint by kind of, well, you based in the US,
Yeah.
You obviously know who Jimmy Kimmel is. Obviously,
Jimmy Kimmel. Yeah. Yeah, he's one
we
of our
don't.
late night hosts, and he
so I got
often
picked
yeah.
up by then, and he used it as part of an introduction to one of his kind of programs.
Yeah, we're gonna put it up real quick so everybody can watch it.
I will never leave the planet Earth. A lot of people want to go into space. I do not. Would you ever go into space, Guillermo?
No, Jimmy, no.
But for those who do, and a lot of people do, a team of scientists from all over the world is making a case that as space tourism continues to grow, people will naturally start having sex in space, like Captain Kirk. And we have to start preparing for this. These findings of a research paper called Consideration of Uncontrolled Human Conception in Emerging Space Tourism. Hot title, right? I mean, getting a little sexed up just saying it, I have to admit. It has 9 authors, this title. 9 very lonely authors worked on this together. And all these people believe we could be buzzing our aldrins together sometime in the next decade. The next decade, I checked today, there are 7 people on the International Space Station right now. They've been on this space station for months. If space sex hasn't happened already, it might happen tonight. It's about to happen. I'd imagine that sex in space is very, like, how do you even tell who's on top? You know? Speaking of uncomfortable sex, today is Melania Trump's birthday. Happy birthday, Melania.
Oh boy.
So my kind of reply is that we're clearly not lonely. At least we've got 9 kind of colleagues to kind of talk to. So we're not completely kind of isolated.
And we're not going to release this very, very special author number 10.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a teaser for another time.
Oh wow.
When we publish the white paper, she will be revealed. It's a she.
It's a she. Okay. Well, I think until then, this is, I think, a great way to, again, say thank you for your time for the show. Thank you for popping back on for a few minutes to help us wrap it up and just talk about some upcoming things. We'll keep an eye out for the symposium in October. That sounds amazing. And again, thank you both, and thank you everybody for tuning in to Liftoff and our special episode on sex and space. We really appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye.